The clock on Marcus Johnson's desk showed 11:30 p.m. as he gathered his papers into his leather briefcase. The lights in the district attorney's office had dimmed hours ago, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the important case files he'd been reviewing. At 35, Marcus had already made a name for himself as one of the city's most dedicated assistant district attorneys, known for his attention to detail and unwavering commitment to justice. He straightened his navy blue tie and checked his reflection in his office window. Even after 14 hours at work, his appearance remained sharp, his suit pressed, his stance confident. Marcus had learned early in life that as a black man in America, his appearance mattered more than it should. The parking garage was nearly empty when he walked to his car, his footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. His new BMW gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a reward to himself after winning a major corruption case last month. The leather seats welcomed him as he settled in, placing his briefcase carefully on the passenger seat. The city streets were quiet as Marcus drove through downtown, past the closed shops and dimly lit restaurants. His mind wandered to the case he'd been preparing, a complex drug trafficking operation that needed his full attention. He'd recently moved to Cedar Heights, an affluent neighborhood on the city's north side. The decision to buy a house there had raised some eyebrows, but Marcus believed in breaking barriers. Why shouldn't a successful black professional live in one of the city's best areas? As he turned onto Maple Drive, just 2 blocks from his new home, blue and red lights flashed in his rearview mirror. Marcus checked his speed. He'd been driving exactly at the limit. Years of experience had taught him to always be careful, especially in this neighborhood where he still felt like an outsider to some. He did everything by the book. Marcus turned on his interior lights, placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and waited. In his side mirror, he could see 2 officers approaching, one on each side of his car. Their hands rested casually on their weapons, a detail that didn't escape Marcus's attention. Well, what do we have here? The officer on the driver's side shined his flashlight directly into Marcus's face, even though the car's interior was already well lit. His nameplate read Sullivan. Little late for a joyride in this neighborhood, isn't it? Marcus kept his voice steady and professional. Good evening, officer. Is there a problem? Officer Sullivan's partner, whose nameplate read Cooper, circled to the passenger side, peering through the windows with exaggerated interest. Nice car, Cooper commented, his tone suggesting he didn't believe it could belong to the man behind the wheel. Real nice car. License and registration? Sullivan demanded, not bothering to answer Marcus's question or explain why he'd been pulled over. Of course, Marcus replied calmly. My registration is in the glove compartment, and my license is in my wallet. I'm going to reach for them now. He narrated his movements carefully, a habit he'd developed over years of similar encounters. As he reached for the glove compartment, Cooper's hand tightened on his weapon. Watch his hand, Sullivan. Marcus could feel his heart racing, but his face remained composed. He'd been in this situation before, but it never got easier. The registration retrieved, he slowly reached for his wallet next. You know, Sullivan said, examining Marcus's license with obvious skepticism, we've had some reports of suspicious vehicles in the area. Lots of break-ins lately. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? No, sir, Marcus replied. I live in this neighborhood, 1242 Maple Drive, just around the corner. Both officers exchanged glances, and Cooper let out a short, mocking laugh. Right, and I'm the President of the United States. Sir, step out of the vehicle, Sullivan ordered, his hand now fully resting on his weapon. Marcus knew this moment well, the crucial point where situations either de-escalated or spiraled out of control. As he prepared to comply, he noticed something that gave him a flutter of hope. Both officers were wearing body cameras. Whatever happened next would be recorded, documented, and eventually judged. Little did Officers Sullivan and Cooper know, they weren't dealing with just any black man in a nice car. They were about to learn a hard lesson about prejudice, power, and justice. But that revelation would have to wait for another day. Marcus stepped out of his BMW slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. The night air was cool against his face, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Officer Sullivan stood uncomfortably close, while Officer Cooper maintained his position near the passenger side, his hand still resting on his weapon. Spread your legs, hands on the car, Sullivan ordered. his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that made Marcus's stomach turn. As he complied, Marcus could feel the rough treatment that followed wasn't necessary. Sullivan's pat-down was more aggressive than protocol required. "So, you say you live around here?" Cooper called out, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He walked over, swinging his flashlight beam across Marcus's expensive suit. "In Cedar Heights? What exactly do you do for a living that lets you afford this neighborhood?" Marcus kept his voice steady, despite the humiliation of his current position. "I'm a legal professional." Sullivan laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Legal professional? What, like a paralegal or something?" "Man, probably just works in the mailroom," Cooper added, both officers sharing a laugh at their own jokes. Marcus could feel his anger rising, but years of experience in the courtroom had taught him to control his emotions. He knew that any sign of aggression, any hint of justified anger, would only make the situation worse. Instead, he focused on memorizing every word, every action, knowing each detail would be important later. "My house is just around the corner," Marcus said calmly. "If you'd like to follow me there, I can prove my residency." "Oh, we'll get to that," Sullivan said, finishing his pat-down with an unnecessarily rough push. "But first, why don't you explain why your windows are tinted? That looks a little dark to me." Marcus knew his windows were exactly at the legal limit. He'd made sure of that when he bought the car. "The tint is within legal requirements, Officer Sullivan. I made sure of that during purchase." "Oh, so now you're an expert on vehicle codes too," Cooper mocked, walking closer. "Listen to this guy, Sullivan. He knows all about legal requirements." Marcus noticed Cooper's body camera blinking, recording everything. He spoke clearly, ensuring every word would be captured. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job, but I haven't committed any traffic violations. I provided my license and registration, which prove both my identity and my vehicle ownership. Is there anything else you need from me?" Sullivan stepped closer, his face just inches from Marcus's. "You know what I need? I need you to drop the attitude. You think that fancy suit and nice car make you special, make you above the law?" "No, sir," Marcus replied steadily. "I have great respect for the law. That's why hands where I can see them." Cooper suddenly shouted as Marcus shifted slightly. "Sullivan, he's reaching." Marcus froze, his heart pounding. He hadn't moved his hands from the car, and they all knew it. But he also knew this dangerous game, how quickly a routine stop could turn deadly over imagined movements. "I haven't moved my hands, Officer Cooper," Marcus said loudly and clearly, making sure the body cameras captured his compliance. "They're still exactly where Officer Sullivan placed them." "What's in your pocket?" Sullivan demanded, though he just finished searching Marcus moments ago. "You just searched me, officer. You know what's in my pockets: my wallet, my phone, and my house keys." "Getting smart with us now?" Cooper asked, moving closer. "You think you're smarter than us?" Marcus remained silent, knowing anything he said would only be twisted against him. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. These officers were building a case against themselves with every word, every action, every abuse of power. Their body cameras continued recording, gathering evidence that would eventually come back to haunt them. "Well, Mr. Legal Professional," Sullivan sneered, reaching for his handcuffs. "Since you want to be difficult, maybe a trip to the station will help adjust your attitude. You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest." As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Marcus kept his face neutral. Inside, though, his legal mind was already at work. Every second of this encounter would be reviewed, every word analyzed, every action scrutinized. These officers had no idea they were giving him exactly what he needed: clear, documented evidence of racial profiling and police misconduct. The handcuffs bit into Marcus's wrists as Officer Sullivan led him toward the patrol car. His expensive suit jacket bunched uncomfortably around his shoulders, and he could feel the night air cooling the sweat on his forehead. Behind them, Officer Cooper was calling for a tow truck to impound Marcus's BMW. "You know," Marcus said calmly, speaking loudly enough for both body cameras to pick up his words, "this is a clear violation of my civil rights." Sullivan tightened the handcuffs in response. "Oh, look at that, Cooper. Our friend here is a civil rights expert now. Bet he learned that watching Law and Order," Cooper laughed, walking over to join them. He held Marcus's phone in his hand, the screen still recording. Trying to film us, huh? That's cute. Marcus had positioned his phone on the dashboard when he was first pulled over, a habit he'd developed over years of similar encounters. Recording police interactions is a protected right under the First Amendment, he stated clearly. Man, you just don't know when to shut up, do you? Sullivan grabbed Marcus's arm roughly, spinning him around. You think quoting laws makes you special? Makes you better than us? A car drove past slowly, its occupants watching the scene unfold. Marcus noticed the driver slowing down, likely recording with their phone. More evidence. More witnesses. I'm simply stating facts, Officer Sullivan, Marcus replied, maintaining his composure. Facts that will be relevant very soon. Cooper stepped closer, his face twisted with anger. Is that a threat? No, sir, just another fact. Sullivan yanked open the patrol car's back door. Get in the car, smartass. Let's see how many facts you know after a night in lockup. As Marcus began to lower his head to enter the car, he noticed something that made him pause. Officer Sullivan, your body camera appears to be loose. You might want to adjust it to ensure proper recording. Both officers froze for a split second. Sullivan's hand instinctively went to his camera, which was indeed hanging at an odd angle. A flash of uncertainty that crossed his face told Marcus everything he needed to know. These officers weren't as confident as they pretended to be. Mind your own business and get in the car, Sullivan snapped, shoving Marcus's head down. The patrol car's backseat was cold and uncomfortable. Through the partition, Marcus could hear the officers discussing what to do with his car. His BMW, containing his briefcase with sensitive case files, was about to be impounded. This was no longer just about him. There were now ethical implications regarding client confidentiality. Officers, Marcus called out, there are confidential legal documents in my briefcase, under attorney-client privilege. Under what? Cooper mocked, turning around in the passenger seat. You watch too many lawyer shows, boy. Maybe a night without your fancy car and fancy briefcase will teach you some respect. Marcus fell silent, watching through the window as a tow truck arrived. He observed every detail, the time on the dashboard clock reading 11:52 p.m., the badge numbers of both officers clearly visible in the streetlight, the way Sullivan's body camera continued to hang askew as he supervised the towing of the BMW. The drive to the police station was filled with more snide comments and veiled threats from the officers. They seemed to grow bolder with each passing minute, apparently believing their victim was just another angry black man they could intimidate into submission. You know what I think? Sullivan said, glancing at Marcus in the rearview mirror. I think you're just another one who bought a nice car and a fancy suit to pretend you're something you're not. Probably borrowed that car anyway. Or stole it. Cooper added with a laugh. Marcus leaned back against the seat, his mind already composing the complaints he would file. Every taunt, every violation of procedure, every moment of racial profiling was being carefully catalogued in his trained legal mind. These officers had no idea they were building his case with every word they spoke. As the patrol car pulled into the station's parking lot, Marcus allowed himself a small, quiet smile. In their arrogance and prejudice, Officers Sullivan and Cooper had given him exactly what he needed: clear, irrefutable evidence of systemic racism in action. Soon, very soon, they would learn the true cost of their actions. The police station buzzed with late-night activity as Officers Sullivan and Cooper led Marcus through the front doors. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Marcus noticed several other officers glancing their way, some with curiosity, others with indifference to what they likely saw as just another arrest. "Look what we caught prowling around Cedar Heights," Sullivan announced loudly to the booking sergeant, a heavy-set man with graying hair. "Mr. Legal Professional here thinks he's above the law." The booking sergeant barely looked up from his computer. "Charges?" "Disorderly conduct and resisting arrest," Cooper replied, roughly pushing Marcus forward. "Found him acting suspicious in a high-end neighborhood." Marcus stood quietly, watching the booking sergeant type. He noticed the nameplate on the desk read Sergeant Williams. Every detail mattered: names, times, witnesses. His years as a prosecutor had taught him the importance of documentation. "Name?" Sergeant Williams asked, finally looking up at Marcus. Before Marcus could answer, Sullivan cut in. Says he's some kind of lawyer. He laughed, encouraging others to join in. A few nearby officers smirked, but others seemed uncomfortable with the obvious mockery. Marcus Johnson, Marcus stated clearly, maintaining his professional tone. And I'd like to make my phone call. Oh, you know your rights, do you? Cooper sneered. Probably got that from watching cop shows. Sergeant Williams typed the name into his computer. Suddenly, his fingers froze over the keyboard. His eyes widened slightly as he stared at the screen. He looked up at Marcus, then back at the screen, then at Sullivan and Cooper. Officers, Sergeant Williams said carefully, could I speak with you for a moment? But before he could say more, another voice boomed across the booking area. What the hell is going on here? Everyone turned to see Lieutenant Garcia striding toward them, his face a mask of concern. He had just walked in from the back office and stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Marcus. Mr. Johnson? Lieutenant Garcia said, his voice filled with recognition. What are you doing here? Sullivan and Cooper exchanged nervous glances. The atmosphere in the room shifted noticeably. Good evening, Lieutenant Garcia, Marcus replied calmly. Officers Sullivan and Cooper arrested me for, as they put it, acting suspicious in my own neighborhood. The lieutenant's face darkened. Uncuff him, now. Sullivan hesitated. Sir, he was resisting. I said uncuff him. Lieutenant Garcia's voice left no room for argument. That's Assistant District Attorney Johnson you've arrested. The sound of keys fumbling and handcuffs clicking open filled the sudden silence. Marcus rubbed his wrists gently, noting the red marks left by the too tight cuffs, more evidence for later. Mr. Johnson, Lieutenant Garcia said, his tone apologetic, my office, please. Officers Sullivan and Cooper, you too. As they walked toward the lieutenant's office, Marcus could hear the whispers starting behind them. He caught fragments of conversations. That's the ADA, the one who prosecuted the Martinez case. They arrested a prosecutor. Inside the lieutenant's office, Garcia closed the door and turned to face them. Mr. Johnson, I cannot begin to express. Marcus held up his hand politely. Lieutenant, with all due respect, I'd prefer to save the official conversations for later. Right now, I'd just like my phone call. I need to check on my car, which these officers had impounded, containing confidential case files. Sullivan and Cooper stood rigid, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. They watched as Marcus pulled out his business card, which they hadn't bothered to look at during their search, and handed it to Lieutenant Garcia. I'll be filing a formal complaint, Marcus said quietly. Multiple complaints, actually, and I trust the body camera footage will be preserved. Of course, Garcia replied quickly. I'll personally ensure. Thank you. Marcus interrupted smoothly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some calls to make. Oh, and officers? He turned to Sullivan and Cooper, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. I'll be seeing you in court very soon, but not quite the way you imagined. As Marcus walked out of the office, leaving behind two stunned officers and their embarrassed lieutenant, he allowed himself a small smile. The wheels of justice were already turning, and for once, they were turning in the right direction. The morning after his arrest, Marcus sat in his office at the district attorney's building, his coffee untouched on his desk. His suit from the previous night had been replaced with a fresh one, but the memory of those handcuffs still burned around his wrists. On his computer screen, he studied Officers Sullivan and Cooper's personnel files, which had been quickly provided after his call to Internal Affairs. A knock on his door interrupted his reading. Come in, Marcus called out, already knowing who it would be. District Attorney Sarah Martinez, his direct supervisor and mentor of 5 years, entered the office. Her face showed the concern she'd expressed during their midnight phone call. Marcus, how are you holding up? I'm fine, he replied, turning his computer screen so she could see it. Did you know Officer Sullivan has had 3 other complaints of racial profiling in the past 2 years? All dismissed due to lack of evidence. Sarah pulled up a chair and sat down. Marcus, you don't have to handle this yourself. We can assign another prosecutor to review their cases. Marcus shook his head. No, I need to do this personally. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick file. I've already started reviewing every case where these officers were key witnesses. Their credibility is now in question. You've been here all night, haven't you? Sarah asked, noticing the multiple coffee cups and takeout containers in his trash bin. I couldn't sleep anyway, Marcus admitted. He turned to his computer and pulled up the body camera footage that Internal Affairs had sent over. Watch this. Together, they viewed the footage of his arrest. Every snide comment, every unnecessary push, every violation of protocol played out in high definition. Sarah's face grew darker with each passing minute. This is, she started. Typical. Marcus finished, but this time they picked the wrong target. He opened another file on his computer. I found 5 other similar incidents in Cedar Heights alone, all involving minority drivers, all dismissed because it was their word against the officers. Sarah leaned back in her chair, understanding dawning on her face. You're going to use your case to reopen those incidents. Marcus nodded. These officers aren't just racially profiling people, they're lying on official reports. That calls into question every arrest they've made, every testimony they've given. He pulled up another document. I've already drafted a motion to review all cases where their testimony was crucial to conviction. The police union won't like this, Sarah warned. The police union doesn't have body camera footage of their officers openly mocking a prosecutor and violating department policies. Marcus played another clip. Look here. Officer Sullivan deliberately adjusted his camera to point away during part of the search. That's against department policy. Sarah watched Marcus for a moment, seeing not just her assistant DA, but a man who had found his mission. What do you need from me? Official authorization to handle all cases involving Officers Sullivan and Cooper moving forward. Marcus handed her a prepared document. And your support when this gets ugly, because it will. Sarah took the paper, reading it carefully. You know this could affect your working relationship with the police department. Marcus gestured to his screen, where the footage showed Cooper mocking his profession. That relationship needs to change anyway. Someone has to take a stand. Sarah signed the authorization and handed it back. Just be careful, Marcus. These kinds of cases can get personal. It already is personal, Marcus replied, pulling up more files. But I'm going to handle it professionally. Every I dotted, every T crossed. When I'm done, these officers won't just face disciplinary action. They'll become an example of why systemic change is necessary. As Sarah left his office, Marcus turned back to his computer. On his screen, dozens of case files awaited review, each one a potential story of injustice, each one a chance to make things right. His phone buzzed with a message. The body camera footage had been secured and backed up in 3 different locations. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Officers Sullivan and Cooper had no idea what was coming, but they were about to learn a valuable lesson about the true meaning of justice. 2 weeks after the arrest, Officers Sullivan and Cooper strode confidently into courtroom 306. They had testified in this courtroom dozens of times before, and today seemed like just another routine appearance. They were scheduled to testify in a drug possession case, the kind of case they handled almost every month. Easy in and out, Sullivan said to Cooper as they walked through the heavy wooden doors. We'll be done in time for lunch. The courtroom was already filling up with the usual morning crowd. Lawyers in suits, defendants with their families, court officers standing guard. Sullivan and Cooper made their way to their usual waiting area, nodding to familiar faces. Something feels different today, Cooper mentioned, noticing several senior police officials seated in the gallery. Why's the brass here? Sullivan shrugged, adjusting his uniform. Probably some high-profile case after hours. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Thompson entered, her face unreadable as she took her seat. Good morning, she said, scanning the courtroom. We're here for case number 2024 CR 789, People v. Richardson. The defense attorney stood up, a face Sullivan and Cooper knew well, but when the prosecutor's chair remained empty, a murmur went through the courtroom. Where's Davis? Cooper whispered to Sullivan, referring to the usual prosecutor. He's never late. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Footsteps echoed on the marble floor. Sullivan and Cooper turned around casually to see who was entering. Their faces froze. Walking confidently toward the prosecutor's table was Marcus Johnson, dressed in an impeccable charcoal gray suit. He carried his leather briefcase, the same one that had been in his BMW the night of the arrest. His face showed no emotion as he placed his briefcase on the table and began arranging his files. Sullivan grabbed Cooper's arm. That's the guy we arrested. Cooper finished, his voice barely a whisper. The color had drained from both their faces. Marcus looked up, making direct eye contact with them. He gave them a small, professional nod before turning to address the judge. "Good morning, Your Honor. Marcus Johnson for the people. I apologize if I'm a few seconds late." "Not at all, Mr. Johnson," Judge Thompson replied. "Though I admit I'm surprised to see you handling this case. Wasn't David Davis assigned to this?" "There's been a reassignment, Your Honor," Marcus replied smoothly. "If I may approach to explain?" As Marcus walked up to the judge's bench, Sullivan and Cooper sat rigid in their seats. They watched as he handed the judge several documents, speaking too quietly for them to hear. Judge Thompson's eyebrows rose as she read the papers. "I see," she said finally. "Very well, Mr. Johnson. You may proceed." Marcus returned to his table and opened his briefcase. The sound of the latches clicking seemed unusually loud in the tense courtroom. He pulled out a stack of files, each one labeled with dates and case numbers. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice clear and strong, "before we proceed with today's case, the people need to address some serious concerns about the credibility of our witnesses." Sullivan felt his stomach drop. Cooper's hands began to shake slightly. "Officers Sullivan and Cooper," Marcus continued, turning to face them, "would you please approach the witness stand? We have some matters to discuss regarding the night of January 16th and several other incidents that have recently come to light." The two officers stood on shaky legs. As they walked to the witness stand, they could feel all eyes in the courtroom on them. The senior police officials in the gallery leaned forward, their faces stern. The defense attorney looked confused but intrigued. Marcus picked up the first file from his stack. On its cover, they could see their own names clearly written. Below them, in bold letters, were the words, "Pattern and Practice of Racial Profiling. Internal Affairs Investigation #2024-47. "Officers," Marcus said, opening the file, "let's talk about your activities in Cedar Heights, shall we?" The courtroom fell silent as Marcus began his questioning. Officers Sullivan and Cooper sat in the witness box, their earlier confidence completely gone. The morning sun streaming through the high windows cast long shadows across their faces, which had grown increasingly pale. "Officer Sullivan," Marcus began, his voice steady and professional, "please tell the court about your department's policy regarding body cameras." Sullivan cleared his throat. They must be on during all civilian interactions and positioned correctly to capture everything." "Correct," Marcus said, turning to switch on the courtroom's large display screen. "Now, let's watch what happened to your body camera during our interaction 2 weeks ago." The footage played, showing Sullivan deliberately adjusting his camera angle during the search. Several people in the gallery shook their heads. The senior police officials watching from the back row scribbled notes. "Would you explain why you adjusted your camera, Officer Sullivan?" Sullivan shifted uncomfortably. It was loose. It was falling." Marcus picked up another file. "Interesting, because I have here 5 other incidents in the past year where your camera was similarly loose during searches of minority drivers in Cedar Heights." Cooper glanced nervously at his partner. Their lawyer, hastily provided by the police union, scribbled frantically on his notepad. "Officer Cooper," Marcus turned his attention to the second officer. "In the footage from that night, you made several comments about my presence in Cedar Heights being suspicious. Could you explain the specific behaviors that made you suspicious?" Cooper's mouth opened and closed several times before he answered. "You were driving slowly." "The GPS data from your patrol car," Marcus interrupted smoothly, holding up another document, "shows I was driving exactly at the speed limit. Try again." The defense attorney in the original drug case sat back, watching with growing interest as his own case was temporarily forgotten. Judge Thompson allowed the questioning to continue, her face stern as she watched the scene unfold. "Let's review your arrest record in Cedar Heights," Marcus continued, placing a chart on the display. "In the past year, you've made 47 traffic stops in that neighborhood. 43 of those stops involved minority drivers. Would you care to explain that pattern?" The police union lawyer stood up. "Objection, Your Honor." This seems beyond the scope of today's case. Your Honor, Marcus responded calmly. These officers' credibility is directly relevant to every case they testify in, including today's case. He held up more files. I have here 12 cases where these officers' testimony was crucial to conviction. In each case, their body cameras experienced convenient malfunctions or were accidentally misdirected during key moments. Judge Thompson nodded. Objection overruled. Continue, Mr. Johnson. For the next hour, Marcus methodically presented evidence of the officer's pattern of misconduct. He showed traffic stop data, complaint records, and body camera footage from multiple incidents. With each piece of evidence, Sullivan and Cooper seemed to shrink further into their seats. Officer Sullivan, Marcus said, picking up the final file, "Do you remember telling me that night that I would learn some respect in jail? That I was pretending to be something I'm not?" Sullivan stared at the floor. I apologize for those comments, sir." "I'm not interested in apologies," Marcus replied firmly. "I'm interested in justice, not just for me, but for every person you've profiled, harassed, or falsely arrested." He turned to Judge Thompson. "Your Honor, based on this pattern of misconduct, the District Attorney's Office is moving to review all cases involving these officers. We're also filing formal complaints with Internal Affairs regarding their conduct." The senior police officials in the gallery were now standing, gesturing for their subordinates to join them outside. The message was clear. This situation had escalated far beyond a simple court hearing. Furthermore, Marcus continued, "We'll be reaching out to every person these officers have arrested in Cedar Heights in the past 3 years. Their stories deserve to be heard." As Marcus finished speaking, the weight of what was happening finally seemed to hit Sullivan and Cooper. Their careers, their reputations, their futures. Everything was now in jeopardy because they had chosen the wrong person to profile that night. "Sometimes," Marcus said, gathering his files, "respect isn't learned through force or fear. Sometimes it's learned through consequences." 3 months after the courtroom confrontation, Marcus stood at the podium in the police department's main conference room. Behind him, a large screen displayed new department policies and training procedures. The room was packed with officers, city officials, and community leaders, all gathered for this important announcement. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Marcus began, looking across the faces in the crowd, "but it has to start somewhere." He noticed officers Sullivan and Cooper sitting in the back row, now in civilian clothes. Their resignations had come 2 weeks after the courtroom incident, following a thorough internal affairs investigation. Chief Roberts stepped forward to join Marcus at the podium. The chief, a 30-year veteran of the force, had taken the revelations about his officers seriously. "Thanks to A.J. Johnson's work, we've identified serious problems in our department. But more importantly, we've created solutions." Marcus clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from the past 3 months. "We've reviewed over 200 cases involving officers Sullivan and Cooper. 47 convictions have been overturned due to misconduct or questionable evidence. But this isn't about 2 officers. This is about changing the system." In the front row, Sarah Martinez, now the newly appointed district attorney, nodded in approval. After the incident, she had made police accountability one of her office's top priorities. Today, Marcus continued, "We're announcing 3 major changes. First, all officers will undergo enhanced bias training, developed in partnership with community leaders." He gestured to Reverend Jackson and Dr. Chin, who had helped create the new program. "Second, we're implementing a new oversight committee consisting of both law enforcement and civilian members. They'll review all complaints of racial profiling and discriminatory behavior." Marcus paused, looking directly at several younger officers in the audience. "And third, we're creating a mentorship program. Experienced prosecutors will work with patrol officers, helping them understand the legal implications of their actions and the importance of proper evidence collection." Chief Roberts took over. "These changes aren't punitive, they're protective. Protecting our citizens' rights and protecting our officers from making mistakes that can destroy careers and lives." From his seat in the audience, Lieutenant Garcia watched with pride. He had been one of the first to support Marcus's reforms, even testifying about the culture that had allowed Sullivan and Cooper's behavior to go unchecked for so long. "But perhaps the most important change," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger, is what's happening in our communities. Since this incident, civilian complaints have dropped by 30%. Community trust is slowly being rebuilt. He clicked to a final slide, showing a photo of Cedar Heights. Every citizen, regardless of their race, deserves to feel safe in their own neighborhood. Every person deserves to be treated with respect by law enforcement. And every officer deserves proper training and support to do their job correctly. After the presentation, as people mingled and discussed the new policies, a young black officer approached Marcus. "Sir," she said, "I just wanted to thank you. What you did, it's making a real difference for officers like me too." Marcus smiled, remembering why he'd become a prosecutor in the first place. "The hard work is just beginning," he told her, "but at least now we're having the right conversations." Later that evening, Marcus drove home to Cedar Heights. As he turned onto his street, he noticed a patrol car behind him, but this time there was no tension, no fear. The officer, one who had gone through the new training program, simply waved as their paths crossed. Inside his house, Marcus loosened his tie and looked at the framed newspaper article on his wall. The headline read, "Day's Office Launches Comprehensive Police Reform After Racial Profiling Incident." Below it was a smaller article about Sullivan and Cooper's resignations and the subsequent departmental changes. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Great presentation today. Ready to start implementing in other precincts." Marcus smiled as he typed his reply, "One step at a time, but yes, this is just the beginning." He walked to his window, looking out at the peaceful street where, just 3 months ago, his life had changed dramatically. Sometimes, he realized, the worst moments could lead to the best changes. What Sullivan and Cooper had meant for harm had become a catalyst for real transformation. The system wasn't perfect yet, far from it. But for the first time in a long while, it was moving in the right direction.